we're talking to a military audience, I think this was not just a tactical failure, this was an operational failure, because it would have had implications far greater than just the tactical success. This would have been operationally significant as part of the overall strategy that Russia was pursuing to try to take control of Kyiv and ultimately, of course, to topple the government, which was its overall objective. The main effort for Russia was to replace President Zelensky and the Ukrainian government with a pro-Russian figure and pro-Russian officials. And then, frankly, to go home to Moscow and have a victory parade. And obviously, the Ukrainian forces prevented that from happening. So this is part of the overall, again, strategy for the main effort of Russian forces in the war. And it turned out that not only was the overall strategy very flawed, the design was really quite horrible. But the execution was even worse. So let me explain. If this is your main effort, you need to put everything at it. Instead, depending on how you count the different axes by which Russian forces entered Ukraine, you obviously had two different axes coming at Kyiv. You had some more, again, Sumy and Chernihiv. You had a battle over in Kharkiv. You had forces coming out of the Donbass, into Zaporizhia, out of Crimea. Again, this is a very, very broad strategic move into Ukraine, and it did not sufficiently weight the main effort. I mean, that's just obvious. If they had achieved victory in Kyiv and toppled the government, then obviously we would have said that their campaign design was very impressive and very effective, and the execution was successful. Obviously, that was not the case. So you start with a very flawed overall strategy and even operational concept. And then when you work your way into the execution of it, you see that the Russians had not trained very rigorously. They'd never achieved true combined arms operations. In other words, tanks that were protected by infantry with artillery to suppress the Ukrainian forces with anti-tank guided missiles in the trees and built up areas on their flanks at night and so forth. They didn't have engineers and explosive ordnance disposal to reduce the obstacles that Ukrainian forces emplaced. And keeping in mind that, of course, President Zelensky only mobilized about 24 hours prior. So again, I was worried that there would not be enough time to emplace all of the obstacles. I've done defense in my life and obviously a lot of offense as well. And the more time you have, time is precious, the better chances you are that your defense will succeed. And so again, Ukrainian forces were still scrambling by the time that the Russians began pouring into the country, albeit along roads, because of course the ground was soft and trafficability, especially for wheeled vehicles, was very, very poor. But beyond that, the Russians didn't integrate close air support very effectively. They didn't integrate electronic warfare. Their command and control systems were on HF, single channel, non-secure, which means that any Ukrainian with a police scanner can find them and jam them or record them if they're criticizing their officers and then upload that on social media. Their logistics were abysmal. We've all known that Russians are not structured adequately for logistics once they leave the rail lines. That proved out. And of course, we saw the flaws in a system that is top down, that does not promote initiative by young commissioned and non-commissioned officers, noting that the young non-commissioned officers aren't professional. They don't have a professional non-commissioned officer corps the way that the US and Western armies do, and the way that, frankly, Ukraine is has been seeking to develop. And I should just note that I watched the development of Ukrainian forces from my first trip to Ukraine, gosh, all the way back. Actually, I was there, believe it or not, during the USSR days when Field Marshal Gromov met us at the airport. But then subsequent to the collapse of the Soviet Union was out in Lviv, the training area, and of course also Kyiv, down in Crimea when it was still Ukrainian controlled, and then watched over the years. And I went to the front lines in the Donbass. I went to Kharkiv, talked to all the leaders in Kyiv, and it was very clear how impressively Ukrainian forces were developing. And I think the Russians completely underestimated, didn't appreciate what had been done, and also didn't appreciate the early supplies of very sophisticated shoulder-launched anti-aircraft missiles and shoulder-launched anti-tank guided missiles. which played a very decisive role early on in this campaign. So what I've done is enumerate a host of ways in which the Russians proved to be very shockingly inept and unprofessional. I'm particularly stunned, frankly, as someone who spent months preparing for invasion of a country, for example, say the invasion of Iraq when I was the commander of the 101st Airborne Division. We used every minute that we had to rehearse every operational and logistical, and often it was the logistical tasks that were far more challenging. How do you establish a refueling point in the middle of the desert, 100 miles into an enemy country, with big bags and bulldozers, and you bulldoze a road and you have to get hundreds of 5,000-gallon tankers. We pumped 500,000 gallons of JP8, this multi-fuel, just from the first location, just in the first 2 weeks, and we had to set it all up in the middle of just open desert. That takes a lot of training. The Russians never could have remotely done that. They didn't achieve combined arms effects, which tells me all that time that supposedly they were doing maneuvers on your borders in Russia and also in Belarus, they weren't taking advantage of that training time. They're basically hanging out. They were camping out. And there's a real lesson there for junior leaders in particular, but leaders all the way up the line. If you have time before operations, make the most of it, because you're never going to get it again. And the Russians clearly wasted that entire opportunity. Final point I would make is that I was one of the very few who said before the invasion that Russia would not take Kyiv, much less ever control it, in part because I know Kyiv, I know how sprawling it is. Yes, it's only half the size of population of New York City, but it's actually a good bit larger in area, has very sprawling suburbs, as you know, and good, determined soldiers who are encouraged to exercise initiative and reasonably well armed, as they were already because of what the UK and the US provided very quickly. They can hold off an armored force if they use those built up areas successfully. I was quite confident they would do that. And indeed, they did do that. And they validated what I told The Atlantic, an important media outlet here in the United States. So again, very, very impressive operations, initiative, determination, courage, innovativeness on the part of Ukrainian forces, and shockingly inept operations by Russian forces.